this podcast, we discuss conflict, various phases of social conflicts, and we discuss what these conflicts can bring us, what positive, what negative, and how we deal with them and how they shape our lives. And today is a very special day because I have opportunity to welcome our international guest, Julia Ebner, who is actually originally from Austria, which is not so far away, but she's coming from London to our conference, Civic Actors in War and Peace. And we have the opportunity to talk a little bit today also in the studio. So welcome, Julia.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Julia, you are expert on radicalization, polarization, and especially on online radicalization. And you are also author of two best-selling, fascinating books, one of which is already available in Slovak as well. And we will put the books in the description of this podcast. But what is fascinating on your work is that you are not just researcher sitting behind the screen or papers or something, but you actually entered various radical groups under hidden identity, and you were really doing courageous stuff to understand how these radical groups, would it be male or female, international or national, how they work and what kind of people are there and what is actually the material they are made of. So can you tell me why? Why did you decide for this kind of career and work?
Yeah, I have to say that I've been working in the field of kind of countering terrorism and violent extremism for 7 years. And what I found was that I was always missing something in the information that I could acquire from looking at the campaigns of radicalization or looking at extremist networks from the outside, through an academic lens or through a researcher's lens. And so I wanted to get closer to actually the people who join extremist groups and who are part of these movements. I wanted to talk to them in person and understand better what's driving them on a very human level. Also, in order to understand what might be potential gateways into de-radicalizing them and potential approaches to getting them out of their extremist groups. So that's why I set up a range of avatar accounts, first online, but then also created identities in offline settings to meet them and to be recruited into a range of different extremist groups along the ideological spectrum.
So you went with fake hair and with glasses and with some other elements of new identity. So you went to some meetings of radical people. And how was it? And were you not scared?
I have to say I was, of course, a little bit scared in some of the moments, also because this was entirely new to me. I had been, of course, following extremist activities online. I knew their vocabulary, their way of communication, which was helpful because I could pretend to be one of them, and I knew their conspiracy myths, so I could be part of a conversation. But at the same time, yes, some of the people I met had a history of violence. Others I knew were just really well connected to online extremist groups that also then later did target me in hate campaigns and in harassment campaigns. So I knew that there would be a risk associated with it. But at the same time, I also felt quite positively surprised by how many human layers there are still left, even within the most extreme of extremists, where you can sense that there are still a lot of potential areas where we can start to work with them on de-radicalization or to get them back into the political middle. And that created a lot of hope for me on a personal level and also in my professional work, that there is so much left in terms of human layers, human identity layers that are not filled with hatred, that are actually, that could be used to bring them back.
So what is it, for example, what did you find out? What would you never realize or find out if you would not go inside this group? What were examples of, knowledge or feelings or understanding which this method of engaged observation was really helpful, that you would not touch it a different way?
I guess there's two different dimensions to this. On the one hand, I feel like I found out a lot more about the individual stories, the personal backgrounds of the people involved, and through direct conversations also understood better where they were coming from, what kind of grievances they had, or how some of them were also just attracted by the movement's social offer, by being part of an exclusive counterculture, and by because the movements offered an antidote to boredom, or that was definitely something where I feel like I understood the drivers of radicalization better, because I saw them firsthand. And on the other hand, I was also exposed to strategic conversations about the tactics in their communications. For example, Martin Sellner, the leader of the identitarian movement of Generation Identity, would brief us about how to respond to tricky journalistic questions, or questions from journalists. For example, are you anti-Semitic or are you racist? And he would basically give a briefing on how to circumvent the question and provide an answer that could not be interpreted as hateful, but equally would convey their ideology. For example, they use all these euphemisms in their ideologies, like ethnopluralism instead of saying white nationalism. And they also have very clear strategic approaches, sometimes building on decades of what governments have been doing in terms of strategic communications, and that's how they base what they base their own online information warfare on. So they have a very clear tactic in terms of how to manipulate mainstream audiences, how to radicalize like-minded people, and how to also intimidate political opponents. So I found that more strategic layer of it also fascinating to get more insights into that.
Yeah, that's interesting. What I hear is that on one hand, people join these kind of groups because of boredom and what was the second thing you were mentioning? Boredom and
entertainment.
And looking for entertainment and fight loneliness, right?
Yeah.
That the community is the need they have. So is it something that these groups are like targeting, specially creating like a feeling of community for people who are lonely, so that's why it's attractive? Or is it other way around, that these people are online and they are only online and that's why they are lonely, so they become something like, like drug abusers, so they are like all the time related only to these online groups?
I would say it's a combination of both the supply side and the demand side. So, of course, extremist movements are unfortunately, very skillful in exploiting loneliness and grievances and that wish to belong to a group. And they've been historically good at setting up their almost own social spaces, their own subcultures that have their own vocabulary, their own insider references and jokes, their own memes. And that's something that even ISIS and jihadist groups have been very good at creating, not just ideological movements, but also cultural, social movements that really create a very strong sense of group bonding, which can be very appealing. But of course, it is also, as you say, it's also a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if you spend so much time in these online groups, you might end up, and that's what I've observed with a lot of these members of extremist groups, losing your real friends, your real family, your real social connections. And that makes you even more vulnerable and even more almost dependent on that new social group you become a part of. And that's also why often you see that extremist movements step by step replace actual family. You see that members of extremist groups even adopt kinship language, calling other members their white brothers or their European, native European brothers and sisters, or their QAnon family. You see that in different types of extremist movements, that there is a strong sense of these people are replacing their real families.
So when we think about what to do against, or how to deal with this, because of course it's a big problem in our society, and for some people it's like a huge conflict which is going on, but it's very difficult to touch, like where to start, where to solve this, or is it like natural development of history that we need to go to some terrible whatever war again to value the peace and somehow democracy or whatever, human rights? Or can we do anything to make these radical groups less attractive for people?
It's a good question, and I'm afraid it's really tricky to reply to that. I guess, unfortunately, we've seen that historically crises have always exacerbated the spread of conspiracy myths, anti-minority hatred, and disinformation. So we've seen that even in times of the plague, the conspiracy theory spread that Jews were behind the outbreak of the plague.
Yes.
In times of cholera, there was the conspiracy myth that doctors were behind cholera in order to harvest organs. And today we're seeing a similar dynamic that we've seen a massive increase in hatred, online hatred and disinformation since the outbreak of the health crisis of the pandemic, but also with the security crisis, with the Russian aggression war in Ukraine, new forms of disinformation, conspiracy myths are spreading. And then, of course, we also have an economic and energy crisis. And all of these crises are, I would say, fueling, unfortunately, some of the radicalization dynamics that we've already seen before that. I think education is a real key factor where we need to do a lot more in not just using digital literacy, teaching digital literacy in schools and also among the older generations, the digital migrants, but also really making, even almost integrating into the curriculum a new subject that looks at the intersection of new technologies and psychology. What do new technologies and social media, what do they do to our psyche and to us as individuals, as a society, or as groups and as a society as a whole? And how does that accelerate some of the radicalization patterns that we've also seen pre-digital media?
Yeah, because when we combine loneliness, boredom, because still we are pretty well off in our societies despite all our fears, but we have loneliness, fears of crisis, and boredom. So that would tell me that, yeah, this is something what is making people really vulnerable to, to all these attractive narratives and attractive ways of spending their time. And yeah, that may be a big question, how to act in crisis to make people feel like they are needed and they are valued. When we just came from the conference and we had a panel about cities and recent war, and we were discussing that maybe a part of the action of governments or municipalities to deal with crisis is to make people busy in a good way, by cultural events, community events, whatever, humanitarian action and community gatherings, so that people are doing something together and not in online but in real time, that this may somehow make them feel like they are together and they are valued and needed. But I am wondering, maybe it's different circumstances when you have just like war and refugees and it's like outside pressure. But when you are in London or I don't know, in some other cities of Western Europe where you don't have this concrete real pressure, how you can act, or what is the way to look at this problem?
Yeah, I think there would need to be, I completely agree, there would need to be a much more strategic look at which population segments in which regional or geographic contexts are the most affected by conflict, by crisis, and then using tailored approaches to fill a potential vacuum that could otherwise be easily filled by extremist groups, which is exactly what we've seen during the times of the pandemic and during the lockdowns, where there was a massive rise in loneliness and mental health issues and so on, and also, of course, socioeconomic fears, uncertainty that could easily be filled by extremists, even hypochondriac fears that were filled by anti-vaxxer movements, and so on. And the same was true, or is true, for the Russian war in Ukraine, where so much of it is also about understanding which population segments are the most affected. And I'm not just talking about the actual conflict zones, but also population segments in other countries that might be affected by the aftermath or the economic consequences, or the consequences of the energy crisis, where unfortunately extremist groups are very opportunistic in spotting whenever there is a weak spot or a rising vulnerability in our society. So I think both on a mental health level, on a socioeconomic level, and on a pure loneliness, boredom level, we should really look at which population segments need what in which moment at time. And that doesn't happen enough from the political side as well.
Yeah, that's true. But at the same time, in your recent book, you are describing various female radical groups, and I just came to my mind the story of I think it was Red Pill group, where there were ladies who were like anti-feminist oriented, and they were supporting each other in absolute subordination to their husbands or boyfriends or whoever were the men they were living with. And that was very strange, as I remember, that you were describing that they are very diverse ladies there, that this is not just poor or lonely women who are frustrated by life because they don't get job or something like that they are rich, they are poor, they are various religions. So can you tell me more about this? What is this kind of radicalization, or is it even a radical that these ladies want to be subordinated to their male spouses?
Yeah, it was really one of the most, I would say, fascinating and also shocking experiences I had in my research when I joined this group of, they call themselves trad wives, traditional wives, but they're part of the bigger manosphere or online subcultures of misogynistic communities. And it's interesting because I always thought that that's not possible. You can't have female misogynists. But this community essentially is set up as you say, as part of the red pill community, which is a term used by the far right to basically in reference to the movie The Matrix, that they now see the world as it truly is. And they range from just very conservative ideologies about gender, traditional gender roles and so on, which is within the spectrum of, legitimate debate. You could say that's just an ideology. But it goes all the way to very hateful anti-feminist conspiracy myths, anti-feminist ideas, and even misogynist ideas, and the promotion of domestic violence and violence against female public-facing figures on the liberal left side of the spectrum. So it's a very mixed bag of different different manifestations of that ideology. But what all of these women had in common was that they were looking for some kind of belonging or help and advice, especially relating to dating, relating to double burdens that women face. They had essentially the equivalent of what we call on the side of the incels or the misogynistic male spheres on the internet call a masculinity crisis. They had a femininity crisis, and they went to those forums in order to get help and in order to get advice from a community and be part of a like-minded community. And what they found was that essentially, or what I saw was that essentially within weeks, a lot of them got indoctrinated and really radicalized. And that also shows, I think that is really representative of a bigger dynamic that's not just happening in that community, but that's also something I observed in other in other radical online communities where you have quite a wide spectrum of different profiles. As you say, you have partly highly educated people there, you have people from various socioeconomic backgrounds. There's no real profile anymore, but it's mostly people with some kind of identity crisis, and because of the wide variation of very extreme conspiracy myths that might spread hate and even call for violence, all the way to just a slightly dissident mindset that doesn't go well with the consensus on what's acceptable within what we call the Overton window, the course of the window of acceptable discourse. But that's what makes it so dangerous, because they manage to get in a lot of people from differing political and socioeconomic backgrounds, and they manage to really widen their reach. And that's also why actually my next book is looking at the mainstreaming of extreme ideas and how come, for example, QAnon and conspiracy myth communities or the anti-vaxxer movement have been able to attract so many different people, from ranging all the way from the very extreme fringes, but also to just concerned parents or concerned people who might be just average citizens with real concerns.
Yeah, and they just want to raise questions, and maybe they have some doubts, and there is sometimes this tiny line where it is just, a healthy suspicions on maybe this is a difficult question, or maybe we should ask more about this, and where it goes to some radicalization or to some conspiracy way. But what is interesting about what you are talking about, crisis of identity or conflicts of identity, in one speeches I've watched or which you have made, you mentioned that recent times conflicts are not any more conflicts on matters, on issues, like, for example, vaccination, that we don't discuss when to vaccinate, who should be vaccinated, under which conditions, and which vaccine is for which group of people better. But they just become conflicts of identities. So either you are anti-vaxxer or you are pro-vaxxer, and there is nothing in between. So what is this also related to online radicalization, or is it something like parallel development in our social way of interaction in our societies?
Yeah, it's one of the biggest concerns, because it's part of a polarization dynamic that we see happening on various topics, and of course that destroys any kind of healthy gray zones or healthy debate, because there is only then that black and white perception of the world. And I do think and agree that part of this is being at least exacerbated and accelerated by the way that online media works, by the way that and echo chambers are a very disputed topic. So there is still a question of to what extent do we really do online spaces really act as filter bubbles, and are we really getting divided into tribes online? But there is a lot of evidence that points to, at least in terms of media consumption and in terms of direct contact or being exposed to people who describe themselves as part of a different identity group, social media unfortunately drives us further apart and drives the different identity groups further apart. And that's because of the way that the algorithms work. That's because of these technological infrastructures that we see. And I would say that that's always existed, but it's definitely being exacerbated. Yeah,
but looking at it from the historical perspective, 100 years ago, people were born with one identity, and it was very difficult to change it. Now, these days, I can choose whatever identity I want. Today, I live in Bratislava. Tomorrow, I can live in Vienna. I can have a different face, making plastic operation. I can have different hair. I can move around the globe and have different profession and have different views, and change my name, change my gender. I can change anything on myself. Isn't it a problem or conflict also for people? Because then they may really get lost in so big possibilities or great possibilities to choose identity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you can, in addition, also mention the disappearance or increasing disappearance of religion, of tribal communities. All of that is part of a loss of identity or perceived loss of identity that leaves a vacuum for individuals where they desire or have a strong desire to be part of a closed community, to have a very strongly shaped identity. And of course, whether we look at jihadist movements like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, or whether we look at white supremacist movements or at conspiracy myth communities, they all give a very strong sense of rooting, of identity and of belonging. And that is unfortunately very appealing. And I agree that that's something that we almost need to think about in a more strategic way. What do also the impacts of globalization and of technological changes mean for our identities, and how can we respond to that in order not to leave a vacuum for extremist groups?
Mm-hmm. Because we still need love, we still need closeness of other people, we still need some value of our being and of our lives, as I can imagine that once we don't get it naturally, then we search for it in some online or offline radical groups because they are telling us, yes, this is the only truth. But let's go also to some personal level of your research. You mentioned that you discover some interesting layers of humanity behind the radical ideology and people who were already they dive in these hate groups, but at the same time there was something human on them. Do you remember some story, or did you make some friendship, or was there something very touching with you which you had to proceed inside of you? Because we are all humans, so you are not only professional researcher, but you were there with your emotions, with your whole personality.
Yeah, I think the most touching and also difficult moments for me were probably when I met very young members, new recruits of extremist movements. Also partly because I had to hold myself back from saying, oh, come on, you shouldn't do this. You know what you're getting yourself into.
To save them, right?
To help them. But because it was part of a bigger investigation, and eventually I wanted to use this to inform, of course, prevention methods. I held back in those moments, but I did see so many, both online but also offline, talk to people who were very young, who just really didn't know what they were getting themselves into, and who were more attracted by the social aspects of it than by the actual ideology. And you could see that that the ideological indoctrination was almost a side product to the socialization, which is also one of the key findings, I think, of my previous book, that that this sense of community creates a very big incentive, especially for young people who join, for example, neo-Nazi trolling armies, because of the ways of gamified approaches that they have, because it's fun, it's entertaining, because they can pretend to be in the military and carry out campaigns that have real-time effects, and where they can then
So when you talk about gamification, isn't it like that there are simulating some computer games, or is it like they are getting some tasks in real life which are using these gamification principles, and they need to do some kind of performance in reality? So what is it exactly about?
Yeah, it's both, but gamification basically means that you turn something that's not actually a game into something that might seem like a game, in order to make it more enjoyable, more entertaining. So, for example, extremist groups have been very good at gamifying their propaganda and their recruiting. So there was a trolling army, a neo-Nazi trolling army called Reconquista Germanica that I joined, where they set up an entire online gaming chat and had structures like in the military, and even called some of their hate campaigns online a sniper mission, or spoke of digital soldiers that would carry out missions in the electronic war battle zone. And so everything was almost looked like a game from the side. I was also undercover with Patriotic Alternative, a UK-based white national movement, and they even hosted video gaming tournaments, but actually in order to indoctrinate newcomers who were just there in order to play the game, but then as a side product of this, they became radicalized. And
this brings me also to the question of violence, because very often people imagine violence that it is something which is like physically hurting you, like in real life. But this is actually a huge amount of violence happening online. How it works, is it like when people get used to this online violence, is it then easier for them to perform violence in real life, or is it not so easy like that?
It's the relationship is more complicated than that, I would say. And for example, studies are not really pointing to the fact that, for example, playing violent video games would necessarily make you more prone to real world violence. However, what I would say is that the lines in the online space become very blurry, the lines between what's real and what's fiction. Mm-hmm. And extremist movements sometimes intentionally try to blur the lines between terrorism and trolling. And we've seen in the past few years that there were even cases of gamified terrorism where the attackers on purpose used video game like, for example, an angle of an ego shooter for their live stream, for example, the Christchurch attacker. But then also the attacker in Germany, in Halle, even drafted a list of scores for every person he would shoot or for every target he would hit. It seemed like in a video game. And there have been video game versions of the live streams of attacks that were shared and where people called for competing with the previous attackers to beat their score in terms of victims. We're talking about terrorism, of course.
So they were asked to beat the score online, like gaming, or really go and shoot somebody on the street?
No, so this is the thing, exactly. They were actually talking about real world terrorist attacks and violence. But of course, it turned into an online, it was an online dynamic that could lead to and inspire new terrorist attacks. But there is something, as you said earlier, there is also the additional level of violence. I'm not sure, it depends a bit on the definition of violence, but definitely online abuse that might not necessarily ever manifest itself physically in the real world, but that still has very real world consequences, even if it purely stays online. But for example, harassment campaigns or doxing campaigns where people's private details are leaked online, where extremist groups sometimes target in a very in a very hateful manner, target journalists or political activists or researchers, any political opponent with a massive amount of targeted hate campaigns or a targeted hateful content. Did you experience this kind of violence on yourself? I've experienced multiple waves of hate campaigns and also threatening campaigns where I received a lot of sexualized violence, which is quite common, of course, especially for female people working in controversial fields and with a public-facing profession. And I've even received death threats in the past. I've definitely, experienced it myself, what also the real world consequences and the psychological consequences of such hate campaigns are.
So, and how did you go through it? What helped you to go on in your work, because it's difficult? It's true. I think for me, it's of course it's an intimidation tactic, and the goal in the end is to silence opponents, or it doesn't even have to be an opponent. It could be even a researcher who just focuses on a specific field that extremists don't like. But so I wouldn't give in to that ultimate goal that they have and stop. I wouldn't want that to stop me from working on my research. But I do have to say that I sometimes just do social media detox. Just basically take a few days without looking at any of my social media channels, because it helps me to get back to reality. And it's sometimes then really helpful to actually step into the next best pub in London or cafe and speak to people in the real world and
encounter people who might also have different political opinions, who might be on the other side of the whatever identity politics spectrum, but who are actually still very nice then, and who are not. So it's nice to get a foot into the real world and see that people are actually, on average, not all completely hateful and opposed.
Yeah, and this is also something that in real world the people are multidimensional. That they are, maybe they have some extremist views, but still they can be fathers or mothers or friends, or they can be nice and offer you coffee. But in this online world, I imagine that they are like two-dimensional or one-dimensional. That this profile is only hatred, or this profile is only neo-Nazi, or only whatever jihadist. And we don't know anything else about this person behind the screen.
Yeah, and it's the same also about the people who are being targeted by hate campaigns. I think it's necessary to humanize the online accounts of political activists or journalists who are attacked purely based on their professional side. But of course, these people are also parents, also have hobbies, maybe are into football, maybe into, I don't know, into watching the same movies, and maybe have lots of shared aspects and common ground with the extremists who actually attack them. Maybe there's not so much in terms of the political side of it, but there might be other layers where there is unfortunately a sense of the online world makes us look beyond that or miss that human layer that lies behind every single online account. It's easier to attack, of course, someone who just has an online account and we don't know that person.
Yeah. So that may be also a nice ending of this talk, that maybe one of the way, except of what we were talking about, that we need to be very careful in creating communities and in asking what particular groups of people need to feel valued in a society, to feel like they belong somewhere. The other part of the answer, what to do, maybe also to make people multidimensional, even in online space, so that we really don't see just one part of a personality. And it's maybe also true for real life that sometimes we see somebody just, he's conservative, he's, I don't know, voter of this party or that party, but at the same time we have some other aspects of our lives and personalities which may be actually connecting.
Yeah.
So that's something, at least something positive we can say. Julia, thank you very much for this interesting talk, and I can even only say that I wish you a lot of success in your work and a lot of courage all the time, and and hopefully there will be some good outcome of your research.
Thank you so much.